Thank you very much for that. And with me now, Liberal MP Kelly O'Dwyer, Labor MP Nick Champion. As you heard there, Nick, Ken Wyatt paid tribute for the apology to the stolen generations, but Anthony Albanese conceding that this is an end of an era, and what has you'd concede has been a divisive era, tumultuous era for Labor as well.
Well, I think, we prefer not to focus on that. We're not running away from it, but I think on these sorts of days you want to focus on the good things, and with Kevin it was undoubtedly the election victory in 2007, the apology, which is an important moment in the life of the nation, going through the GFC, and of course saving the furniture, and I guess I was part of that furniture. So I've got a great deal of affection for Kevin, but my memory of him will be a sort of a personal one, which is in the middle of the GFC we managed to secure a second car, the crews down at Holden's, and we had this day where there were thousands of workers there, and Kevin came down and spoke to them, and it was a very real moment where you knew that the government action that was taken during the GFC did have a very direct and real impact on people's lives in my electorate. So that will always be, I think, my own personal memory of Kevin as Prime Minister.
Kelly, there's enormous civility on moments like this, and as I mentioned a bit earlier, a very gracious and generous speech from the Prime Minister. Why does it take, the departure of a senior figure to bring out that in the Parliament?
Well, look, I think we all recognise that Kevin Rudd has earned his place in history, and it is appropriate for everyone to focus on his achievements when he was Prime Minister. I mean, he was able to be Prime Minister not once but twice. To be Prime Minister once is a tremendous achievement in and of itself. To do it twice is quite extraordinary. And the national apology, I think quite rightly, has been lauded from both sides of the chamber. It is something that unfortunately we didn't do in government, and I think it's something that we ought to recognise Kevin Rudd for doing. But, we will have some policy disagreements as to the path he took our nation down, and I think it's appropriate that on a day other than today that we litigate that at a future point.
Let's litigate some other stuff now. The debt limit. Joe Hockey won't capitulate, Nick Champion. He's made it clear if the debt ceiling is not agreed to, he will make the cuts necessary in the May budget so that we don't hit that ceiling. Is Labor going to have to rethink?
Look, it's a strange approach for the Treasurer to take. And he starts out by saying there are possible headwinds out of Europe next year that would justify us having such a large increase in the debt limit. That was his justification for it. It would seem to me that that's a justification, incidentally, for the approach that the previous government took during the GFC. That is, that we don't live on some sort of island, we're an insular economy, that we're affected by the rest of the world. All he has to do is explain that to the nation, to the Parliament, to parliamentarians. It doesn't seem to me that that's an unreasonable thing to do, to explain the state of the world. And if he does that, then there can be sensible negotiations about the debt limit. And that's all he has to do. Even putting that aside, we've offered to raise a debt limit. It's just we won't sign, the colloquial blank cheque, as it were, for a massive increase in the debt limit. And that's quite understandable.
Kelly O'Dwyer, is this about just pinning Labor with all the debt now, early on in your term,
didn't have debt
so you don't have to worry about it later?
In the previous government, in our government, in the previous coalition government, there was no debt.
There was no GFC.
All of this debt
no GFC
is, well, hang on, Nick. You've given us a good line on being a comedian.
No
but
GFC.
let me just make this point, and that is that there was no debt under the previous coalition government. You have now racked up so much debt that we're going to crash through the $300 billion debt ceiling that was created. Now, the Labor Party had to increase the debt ceiling from 75 to 200 to 250, now up to 300. Before the election, Labor, according to its own
every
figures...
single time, every single time you ask for a justification to do so.
I listen to you. Every single time, Labor said that they wouldn't reach the debt ceiling. And before the election, in the pre-election and fiscal outlook, Labor, according to its own figures, said that we were going to reach this debt ceiling, we're going to crash through it before the end of the year. That's $300 billion. According to those figures, we're also going to, in 2015-16, get through a peak debt of $370 billion.
Which is well below the 500.
According to the Australian Office of Financial Management, we need at least a $60 billion buffer as well. This is why we have responsibly said...
But a buffer against what?
This is why we have responsibly said that we would need to increase the debt ceiling, Labor's debt, the debt ceiling, so that we can provide financial stability to our system so that people have confidence to be able to make decisions.
Why doesn't that make sense to Labor?
It might
to have the buffer.
It might make sense if you explain why you need the buffer, and they haven't done that.
But they're offering to you the Treasury Secretary to provide a briefing.
Well, that's a fair enough point, Kieran. But here's the thing.
But it was Wayne Swan's own advice. This is the advice to Wayne Swan that he tabled in the Parliament.
It's not just about explaining to me or to the Leader of the Opposition. It was about explaining to journalists, to the Parliament, to the people. You've got to actually be honest about the state of the world.
Okay, Kelly, finally, just quickly, I want to move on.
We have been honest. It's Labor's debt. We now have to deal with, unfortunately,
it's the
what
consequence
we have
of a
inherited.
global financial crisis.
No, I mean, come on.
That's what it is.
Come on.
It's a consequence of a global financial crisis.
Let Kelly finish, and then we'll move on.
We need to be responsible. We have inherited, a completely wrecked system, and we have to repair it. And that's what we're setting about doing. Now, it's not a target we're going to aim for. We're going to try and restore the balance sheet. But to do that, we need to increase the debt limit.
Only 2 minutes left. I do want to ask you both quickly. Tony Abbott denies Indonesia, rejects the notion that Indonesia is calling the shots when it comes to the border protection issue. Aren't we seeing just the inevitable issues of international diplomacy here when you're facing a difficult matter like this and a government that is attempting to get on the front foot with it?
Well, the problem is this is a government that says one thing and does another. It said that it was going to be more Jakarta than Geneva, and now where do we find our relationship with our most important neighbour?
It's very good.
And that is the critical thing. It's become a point of contention because of a very small part, the turn back the boats policy. We all know that the most important thing in terms of border protection is offshore processing, and that's what we should be focusing on. And frankly, if the government wants to go to Malaysia and do the Malaysian transfer agreement, or do it with some of our other neighbours, that would be a good thing. Get away from the turn back the boats policy because it's chaos. It's causing chaos in our relationships.
Agreement.
You should be.
Let's hear Kelly now. Your response.
What we're talking about when there's been all this commentary regarding, people who are at distress at sea in Indonesian waters is the Australian government coming to rescue people and simply having a conversation with the Indonesian government about returning those people who are in Indonesian waters. I think
but they're not copying it. But they're not copying it. That's the bottom line, though.
We have a very good relationship.
But the Indonesians aren't accepting that idea.
Well, it is a very good, strong, robust relationship. We will continue to have discussions with our Indonesian counterparts, and that's the appropriate thing for a government to do.
Kelly O'Dwyer, Nick Champion, thank you both.
Thanks.
Have a good day. A quick